Well, here I am again. I've turned into a bit of a bad penny, have I not? But we got to get this done. And honest to goodness, these are going to be so important. These ideas and facts and realities and backgrounds are going to be so important to the trip. So one more lecture on Jerusalem and the history of Jerusalem. And again, you'll see I call it the drama of the 20th century. We have come this far, that is, we've come to the 20th century, and here we are. Well, let me pick it up where we were. I won't review all of this, but this is the sort of the breakdown that I've given you over the last couple of lectures. But again, we come down to the Muslim period beginning in 638, the very brief Crusades, but then the second Muslim period down here that, in fact, brings us down to 1917. And we made much of this last time, that it was in 1517 that the Ottoman Turkish Empire took over this part of the world, primarily under Suleiman, who built the walls we're going to live inside of. And that empire, the Turkish Empire, really decimated the land and made horrible merchandise of the Jews, but stripped the land bare. And that brings us down into the first. And remember that at the end of the 20th century, the end of the 19th century, in the 1880s and so on, there was born this hugely important movement called the Zionist movement. This political effort to establish in their ancient homeland a state to which the Jews of the world could repair. And that brings us then to the 20th century. So here again, here's this second Muslim period that we just talked about, and Zionism is born in the late 1800s in response to the abuses, not only by the Ottoman Turks, but all over the world. The Russian pogroms. As a matter of fact, there have been, and we don't have this in the notes, but there have been, usually historians will identify 5 aliyahs. And an aliyah, the aliyah is the Hebrew word for up, but it in the Bible, you again and again go up to Jerusalem. And so when Jewish people from all over the world return to Israel and settle in Israel, make it their homeland, they're making aliyah. And there have been 5 great sweeping aliyahs where tens of thousands of Jewish refugees from various parts of the world have fled to Israel and settled there and been absorbed there. So at any rate, a couple of those early aliyahs were involved with this whole Zionist movement and so on. I remember that for the first 50, 70 years of those efforts, there was no state of Israel. It was, well, that's where we're headed. So 1917, into the First World War, the Ottoman Turkish Empire is denied this part of the world, and it's divided up. This part of the Eastern Mediterranean world and beyond is divided among the various conquerors, the United States, Britain, France, and so on, Holland, and the part, Israel itself, the part of the Eastern Mediterranean world, which is going to become Israel, is given over to the United Kingdom, to Great Britain, as a mandate. Now, that mandate is very specific. This is going to be called, from 1917 to 1948, I'll come back to it, is going to be called the mandatory period. You have to know this. This is, the mandatory period is going to end with the birth of the State of Israel. But it's called the mandatory period because the newly birthed League of Nations, international, that coalition, that organization of nations that was birthed after the First World War, largely by Woodrow Wilson and so on. One of their early steps was to mandate that Great Britain take control of the part of the world which at that time, again, was called Palestine, And it's just this entire area at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. And that word, I say again, Palestine, was a fairly innocuous, non-political descriptor at that time. But Great Britain was given by the League of Nations, by the world community, the mandate to establish in Palestine a homeland for the Jews. That was the mandate. Now, I give you a couple of dates here. 1917 is when the Balfour Declaration was issued. And that was simply, as I'll say, a declaration whereby Britain expressed her determination, that she affirmed the idea of a Jewish homeland in ancient Palestine. And that was issued by Lord Balfour in 1970. But then in 1922, it was made part of that League of Nations mandate, which gave it the force of law. It had no political or legal force as the Balfour Declaration. It was a simply expression of the fact that His Majesty's kingdom looks with favor upon the idea of a Jewish homeland. But then when that wording was included in the official League of Nations mandate to Great Britain, it was given the force of law. And so now Britain now is in charge, and of course the Arab population there in Israel begins to push back, in Palestine begins to push back violently, and you have all sorts of riots, and it becomes very, very difficult for the Brits. And in 1930, 80% of that land, actually Transjordan, all the land, I'll show you in just a moment, east of the Jordan River in that mandate, was given to a Hashemite kingdom, or a Hashemite family, an Arabian family called the Hashemites, and it became Transjordan. We know it today as Jordan with its capital Amman, but that time it was called Transjordan. And there was just, again, continued to be a tremendous amount of struggle in Israel and what we know today as Israel between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And in 1947, hugely pivotal point where the now this is after the Second World War. The League of Nations had been disbanded, and the world fought a second war, and Germany was once again defeated. And after that war, there was called into existence this organization called the United Nations. And in 1947, November, they voted to partition the land. More struggles, and finally Britain left. So the British mandate from 1917, really official in 1922, but from the end of the First World War to the end of the Second World War. And in 1948, Britain abandoned the mandate and abandoned the territory. Now, let me develop this just a little more. Here are some notes on the very, very important Balfour Declaration. I say here that it was a letter dated 2nd of November 1917 from the United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour. Very interesting man. He had been the prime minister. He was no longer, but he was in the administration, and he really was not at all a Christian, but he had been raised on the Old Testament, and he had come to understand that the Jews had been horribly mistreated by the world at large for hundreds of years, and he was very sympathetic to the notion of a Jewish homeland, and so he was able to get the Parliament to affirm this declaration, which he sent to the neonate Zionist Federation. But notice, I'll read it to you here in the yellow. His Majesty's government view with favor. So there's nothing legal here. We like this idea. The establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. And they used their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. And it says, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. So they're not saying we're going to run everybody out and put the Jews. They're saying, no, we think that and again, at this point, you have to understand, and this is so important, and it's so non-intuitive. Before 1922, in 1922, there was a conference held in San Romeo, Italy, and the victorious allies drew every single political boundary that exists in the Near East today. Up until that time, 1922, really, for all of those hundreds of years in this part of the world, you didn't have national boundaries. You had different foreign powers that controlled various regions. and there was no Egypt. I mean, with boundaries, there were the Egyptians, and they controlled a lot of territory, and their control would expand and then contract and so on with neighboring nations. So Palestine was absolutely, number one, it was totally uninhabitable. It's so difficult for us to appreciate the degree of absolute desolation and ruin excuse me, that had befallen Palestine, the land of Israel, the land that's going to become Israel. And I will say this to you again and again: when we are making our way across the highways and we see the fertile fields and we see the high rises and we see the industry and we see the transportation and everything so modern and functional, and you can use the internet, listen, that is so recent. It's in most cases that what you see there is younger than I am, for heaven's sakes. So the point is that the land had been terribly desolate, and so it was underpopulated, a very, very small population. I think around 300,000 in all of the land, that is Syria and Lebanon and Jordan, what we call today Jordan, and Israel, and it was desolate. And there was an Arab population there. There was a strong Jewish population. But the intent of the declaration is that we will establish a national home, a state with boundaries and a capital and a constitution, and that state will be recognized by the world community. It'll be a place for Jews, and we'll do that without, as it says here, abridging the rights or taking the property of any people living there. All right, so that was the Balfour Declaration after Lord Arthur Balfour, and 1917. And as I say, in 1948, there had been so much trouble. And ever since 1947, well, as a matter of fact, I'll go a little further. The War of Independence happens in 1948, the State of Israel. Now, here is what is at stake. On November 29th of 1947, the UN General Assembly, this is their first official action. They've just called themselves into existence. And there had been struggles that had been going on for some time between the Arab population and the Jewish population, small and scattered as it was. It tended to cluster around places like Jerusalem and Ramallah to the north and so on. But anyway, a vote was taken in the UN to partition this land. So again, all of this land over here, which was part of the original mandate, had already been given to that Arabian family, and so that's called Transjordan. So all that's left is the land between the sea and the Jordan River. And this land, the gut-wrenching struggle had gone political and so on for many, many years. And finally, the UN came up with this plan. And the idea was that there will be two states. And the orange will be Arab, and the light blue will be Jewish. And Jerusalem would actually be a internationally controlled, divided city. Well, frankly, without spending any time with it, even though it looks somewhat proportionate, remember, everything south of here is total desert. So the Jews just got little tiny strips of land along the coast here, and all the hill country and so on was to be, and it seemed entirely unworkable. It meant that there would be a strip at which the land was only 8 miles wide. How you could defend this was impossible to know. Now, there was a provisional government during this mandatory period from 17 to 48. The Jews, over time, had developed a provisional government, and that provisional government, under the remarkable leadership of David Ben-Gurion, accepted the plan, as in spite of the fact that it seemed like it could not work. On the other hand, all the Arab entities totally rejected it, and they insisted that they would not have any land given to the Jews. They were going to push the Jews into the sea. And so they began what's called the Civil War. That began in November of 1947. In reaction to that, the Brits, who were still controlling this area and who were being constantly attacked by both sides. It was just the most untenable, violent situation. And so the Brits, the Great Britain, just announced that on May 14th, 1948, they were leaving. They'd had it. They couldn't control it anymore. They were leaving. And at that point, there began this great debate in the Jewish world as to how they should react. And the United States, under Harry Truman, and more importantly George Marshall, the state's Secretary of State, begged the Jewish leaders not to establish a country, to let the United States intervene and bring this to some workable situation. But David Ben-Gurion insisted that this was the chance and they were going to take it. And so on May 14th, I guess I don't have this, but on May 14th, 1948, the British were going to leave. And so David Ben-Gurion, on that night, it was a Friday night, Sabbath was about to set in. They needed to make this announcement before the Brits left. And he went on the radio and read from Independence Hall in Tel Aviv the Declaration of Independence. Now, the Civil War, as it's called, was already going on. It had been going on since November. But now the Arab neighbors, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Iraq, declared war and attacked. And that gave you the War of Independence, which went on until early in 1949, and went on, I recall, I don't have it in front of me, but about 11 months. And finally, there was a truce called. And when the truce was called, they simply drew lines around the territory controlled by the Arab forces and by the Israeli forces, and you had the state, the state of Israel, and I think I have it here. Yes, here it is. Now, this is actually, I'm discussing here the 6-Day War. I'll come back to it, but I want you to notice that as of 1948, and this is what's in the news all the time these days, because there is movement on the part of our president and so on to get Israel to return to the 1948 borders. Let me say, there never were any borders in 1948. There never have been. What happened was that they were, the lines had to do with the territory that was controlled by the competing armies when the truce was called. So here's what I want you to notice, that this was basically Israel right here. And in the middle of Israel was this area in green, which is variously called the West. Well, let me explain it to you. Get this now. When the dust settled, and maybe this isn't the best map, but it will work. This area in green was controlled by the Arab armies, and so it was annexed by Transjordan. And in point of fact, this land over here, which had been called from 1930 to 1948, had been called Transjordan. Transjordan means on the other side of Jordan. And the land beyond Jordan is called Transjordan. And so when this area over here to the east was just sort of single-handedly by Winston Churchill handed over to this this Arab family, and it was called Transjordan. Now, in 1948, the War of Independence, when the war was over, the truce was called, this area right here was in the hands of the Arab armies, so it was annexed by Transjordan. And because for that time, from 1948 to 1967, Jordan had part of her territory was on the west side of the Jordan River, they said, well, we shouldn't be called Transjordan because part of us is on the other side. So they changed the name to Jordan. And the country that you know of as Jordan today was from 1930 to 1948 called Transjordan. Then in 1948, because they, in point of fact, it turned out to be temporary, took control of a part of the land which was on the other side of Jordan, they changed their name to Jordan. So from 48 until 67, Israel didn't include this little strip right here. This was Egyptian, and didn't include this strip right here. And this was called the West Bank. Now, it was called that, understand this, because it was the part of Jordan that was on the west bank of the Jordan River. So here's the Jordan River, and there was part of the land of Jordan, this part right here, which was west of the river, so it was called the West Bank. This is why I don't think it's appropriate to call it today the West Bank, even though that's what it was known for all those years. But here it is right here. That was the West Bank. And the fact is that today Jordan doesn't possess it. They don't have any land on the West Bank of the Jordan. All right, so here's my point. I'm kind of confusing it here. I should have had put in a map of the borders, or the truce lines, the ceasefire lines in 1948. But from 1948 until what happened in 1967 was the Six-Day War. I'm going to talk about that. But from 1948 to 1967, all that you see in the tan here was Israel. Now, hugely important, and I thought it'd be good, you should know this, to take you through the wars. So the three major wars, there have been constant skirmishes and others that we might mention, but the three great wars in the history of the modern state of Israel was, first of all, the War of Independence. And of course, that was the war by which they secured their identity as a nation state. And that went, here it is, truce was established in January. So it was from May 14th until January 2nd. And again, Jordan was given the West Bank. And notice that Jerusalem was a divided city. If you notice here, this line right here was called the Green Line. And again, it was the truce when the ceasefire was called, and it goes right through Jerusalem. So from 1948 to 67, the city of Jerusalem was entirely a divided city. And the old city where we will stay and where we will explore and enjoy ourselves was entirely in Jordan. The modern city of Jerusalem was divided in two, but the ancient city, the old city, the walled city, the Sulamine, the magnificent walled city, was entirely in Jordan. You couldn't go there. You could go to Jerusalem, but you couldn't go to the old city. As a matter of fact, there was a very hot border, very, very dangerous, a no man's land. So that's from 1948 to 1967. This area in tan was the area that was Israel. Now, let me say this too. There is this long tail, and that really is, that was part of Israel in order to give them access to the Gulf of Aqaba, the Red Sea, and the China Sea. So this is the Red Sea, and you have these two fingers. This is the Gulf of Suez with the canal up here. This is the Gulf of Aqaba with the Straits of Tiran. And this right here is where Jordan and Sinai and Egypt, this is now Egypt, and Saudi Arabia all come together very closely. But the point is that all of this area, it really is pretty. Beersheba is always regarded as the furthest south you can have a habitable city. Now, today, with engineering and so on, there are cities down here, but it's pretty uninhabitable. So the main habitation is Beersheba in north. But 48 to 67 is the tan. Now, in 1967, their relations with neighboring countries were deteriorating. Egypt had thrown out the UN peacekeepers. They were amassing armies on the border. Syria was doing the same thing. And it was very obvious that they were about, like I say, they were quite upfront that they were about to attack Israel, and their intent was to push her into the sea. And in June 5th, 1967, Israel launched a huge preemptory attack. And she wiped out the entire Egyptian Air Force in a matter of hours. There was great panic, great confusion. The Egyptian leader, president by the name of Nasser, persuaded Syria and Jordan that he had destroyed, in fact, his Air Force, and only Egypt had a considerable Air Force in 1967, have been totally obliterated. We'll talk about it. But he persuaded Syria and Jordan that he had actually destroyed Israel's Air Force, and in the confusion, they attacked. And the Six-Day War, it's called the Six-Day War because in 6 days, Israel was able to to win the war. And as I say here, Arab lost over 20,000. Israelis lost about 1,000. That's a huge number in Israel. It's a very small. But what I want you to see here is at the end of the Six-Day War, the area in green is area that Israel had captured. She had captured the entire Suez and actually the entire Sinai, and had crossed the Suez and was marching on Cairo. She had conquered entirely this West Bank. She had totally captured the West Bank. And interesting, there is an area just to the east of Upper Galilee in Syria called the Golan Heights. So these are the three areas that she had, Sinai, including Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights she had conquered. Now, in time, rather shortly, she gave back to Sinai, to Egypt, though it's oil rich, but she gave it back for peace. And but she has refused to give back the Golan Heights. The West Bank is in a state of flux right now. I don't like to call it the West Bank because, again, it's not part of Jordan on the west side of the Jordan River. It's sometimes it's called the occupied territories. I think that's misrepresented, the disputed territories. Guess what? Israel likes to call this area Judea Samaria, because that's what it was in antiquity. But at any rate, the point is that at the end of the Six-Day War, two very, very important. In 1967, Israel was able to capture two hugely strategic territories that had not been hers between 1948 and 67. They are the West Bank and the Golan Heights. And they're in dispute. Now, they're not going to give the Golan Heights back at all. The disputed territories are just that. But know that Israel expanded her size and her security capacity hugely in the 67-day war. 67 Six-Day War. Now, one other point. The refugee issue. When the Arabs were making ready in 1967 to attack Israel, they advised their own citizens to uproot and leave, promising them that after the Israelis had been totally destroyed, the refugees could come back, resettle, and spoil the Israeli villages. And they did that. Well, in point of fact, Israel won that war. There were some who were chased out by the Israelis. Most of the refugees left because they had been advised to by their Arab overlords. They have never been to this day accepted into any of the many Muslim Arab countries that surround. They live in camps, refugee camps. Those camps have become cities. There's a great deal of squalor and crime and violence. It's not a good situation, but they are kept there as political pawns. On the other hand, and it's really kind of startling, as soon as that war started, Jews all over the Arab world who had lived there for thousands, literally thousands of years, were uprooted, cast out, many of them slaughtered. They were pillaged. They weren't allowed to take their stuff. Synagogues all over the Arab world were burned. Torah scrolls were burned, and so on. So you have about 300,000 Palestinians and about 100,000 Syrians, near 400,000 refugees from Arab refugees who are forced out of Arab countries in the anticipation of the Jews being slaughtered. And then you have about an equal number of Jewish refugees forced out of Arab countries from all over the region. And every one of those was welcomed. Not all of them came, but Israel absorbed the state of Israel absorbed carefully, deliberately, resourcefully, absorbed those Jews in short order, those Jewish refugees. So one of the two results of the Six-Day War of 1967, one is the expanded territory and security of Israel. The West Bank is theirs, and they call it Judea Samaria, and they possess the Golan Heights. Gaza, of course, has become an interminable problem, indescribable, and they've given Sinai back. But they still possess, although they've allowed some Palestinian administration and rule, Israel still entirely possesses that disputed territories and the Golan Heights. And the refugee crisis is an ongoing political pawn. So the Six-Day War in 1967, and then in 1973, there was a surprise attack on Yom Kippur, the holiest day and it was very deliberate. Jews all over the world fast and are quiet and on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And in 1973, there was a surprise attack across the Suez of Egypt. Syria attacks the Golan Heights. And by October 14, they had turned it around, and the Jewish forces were within 35 miles of Damascus and marching on Cairo. It was a remarkable feat. Here is a description of that. This is the Yom Kippur War, 1973. It says here, fought from October 6th to the 25th, but you had this coalition of Arab states. They attacked on Yom Kippur secretly, and there was almost temporary. There was just such despair. It looked like we were watching the news in America, and it looked like Israel might be wiped off the face of the map. I mean, it was very, very real possibility. But once again, one of the big issues here was that the USA, under Richard Nixon, just threw open the larders and the coffers, and he insisted and commanded, whatever supplies Israel needs, send them, airlift them. On the other hand, the USSR was supplying military needs of the attacking Arab states, and there was there was a lot of tension. There was World War III talk going on. But when the dust settled, once again, Israel had conquered the Sinai. They had extended themselves into Syria and so on. Now, all of this land they've returned and so on. So now, once again, they occupy only the green, which is these Golan Heights. Here's this West Bank, which they entirely occupy, though they've allowed some Palestinian self-rule. Of course, Gaza has been a struggle over the last several years. So, 1948, War of Independence. They are able to push back their enemies against all conceivable likelihood and odds, and Israel becomes a state. 1967, peremptory strike because of the clear intention of Arab enemies on all sides to attack, and they're able to increase their territory and their security. They're able to, but you have this ongoing refugee crisis. 1973, the Yom Kippur War looks horribly desperate. One of the strategies, by the way, and this is biblical, my persuasion is that the Arabs are generally, and I realize that's a very, very difficult designation, Arab, but without getting into it, that the Arab peoples are the sons of Ishmael, and Ishmael is defined or is described by God as a wild donkey of a man, which is not as defamatory or as pejorative as it sounds. The donkey is an important animal and very valuable and helpful, but he's not easy to control. And then it goes on to say every man against his neighbor. And in 1973, one of the very deliberate strategies of the Jewish leadership, the Israeli leadership, was to hold on until the Arabs started fighting among themselves, which they did. They started to struggle over strategy and territory, and the Jews in the providence of God, the Israelis were able to turn the tides and win a remarkable victory. So 1979 Camp David Accords, I won't get into those, but that's where Egypt supposedly acknowledged, well, she did on paper. And Egypt has been a friendly foe for a lot of years up until the Obama, what made such a mess of it here in the last 7-8 years. But at any rate, the Camp David's Accords were an attempt to, in the days of Jimmy Carter, to settle the problem between the Jews and the Arabs, and it was a total collapse, a total fiasco, with all the effort, money, and time, and energy, and hope that was put into it, failed entirely. And there have been several other attempts, but I'll leave it at that. So here's the review. We're talking about the drama of the 20th century. We've come into the 20th century, second Muslim period, Ottoman Turks. They're on the wrong side of World War I. The land is divided. Now you get the mandatory period. And this, again, is when the newly formed League of Nations assigns Britain the mandate, the stewardship, the responsibility to produce in Palestine a home for the Jews. They give up the land east of the Jordan and give it all to Transjordan and so on. But finally, at the UN partition plan, it's very important. In 1947, you have the UN partition plan. That produces a civil war. finally, the Great Britain just says we're out of here, and Israel declares a war of or declares her independence. That happens from May 14th to January. So that is, the War of Independence goes until January, and when the dust settles, the truce lines are drawn, and there is this West Bank that Jordan possesses, and Jerusalem's a divided city. That obtains with some excitement until 1967, Six-Day War, peremptory strike, and when the dust settles, again, you have Israel has the West Bank and the Golan Heights, and then finally, for our purposes here, the Yom Kippur War in 1973. So know those wars, be able to sort them out. The Israel that we will visit is remarkably secure. Her borders are well policed and very, very secure. But as she likes to say, she's a nice people who live in a very bad neighborhood. And to the south, Egypt has been a friendly neighbor, but it's tough now. Gaza has become a huge trouble spot. Syria, of course, with the civil war that's going on with Assad, it's a horrible spot. Lebanon has been intermittently troublesome. But Jordan to the east has really been quite a friendly neighbor. But with all of that, Israel having won her independence in the middle of the 20th century, now in the 21st century, has maintained her identity, and it's my persuasion, but we'll talk about that in another time. All right, thank you.